Okay, good afternoon again. Welcome to our September edition of the Conservation Outcomes webinar series. I'm going to forward this slide here. There we go. My name is Liz Marshall, and I am the Outcomes Team Leader for NRCS's Outcomes Team. The Outcomes Team hosts this webinar series to highlight activities across NRCS that are related to its efforts to assess and quantify the impacts associated with its conservation program. If you would like to be notified of future webinars, you can subscribe to a mailing list at the Conservation Outcomes Webinar Series website. And there is a link to that website in the box entitled Today's Links on your screen. We'll get started with the presentation in just a minute. I just want to go through a few logistics. The webinar is being recorded. All participants are in listen-only mode. So please type any questions or comments as they come up into the Q&A box that you will shortly see appearing on your screen. And we'll get to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If you're having problems with your audio, computer or mobile device headsets can help sometimes with audio quality and volume, but there is also a closed captioning link that's provided in the box on your screen entitled Today's Links. And those captions open in a new browser window, and you can follow along with the presenter's comments there. Also, please note that the presenters have provided a number of relevant URLs under the Today's Links box, and they have also provided a few handouts, including a PDF of today's slides and a document that lists the citations for the studies that they will be referencing today. Those documents are available to download from the box on your screen entitled Today's Handout. And finally, if you would like to make the slide presentation pod larger, you can use the icon with the 4 corner arrows that appears in the upper right of the presentation box to turn on and off the full screen view. I'm now pleased to turn the microphone over to Mike Shrub, Director of the Resource Inventory and Assessment Division in NRCS's Deputy Area for Soil Science and Resource Assessment. Dr. Shrub will provide some introductory remarks, and then we'll turn the webinar reins over to Charlie Rewa. Charlie is the Wildlife Component Leader for the Conservation Effects Assessment Project here at NRCS, and he will be moderating today's webinar. Thank you, and the mic is now yours, Dr. Shrub.
Thank you, Liz. Welcome to the latest installment of NRCS's Outcomes webinar series. As you know, NRCS has a long history of working with farmers and ranchers to help them conserve the natural heritage and sustainability of their operations. These monthly webinars give us a way to communicate to our stakeholders the importance of voluntary conservation programs and the funding provided through the Farm Bill for these efforts, and to highlight some of the documented outcomes in terms of natural resource and economic benefits. For nearly 20 years, our Conservation Effects Assessment Project, or CEAP, has been documenting outcomes of our work on a variety of resource concerns. CEAP works closely with our science partners in other agencies and academia, and outcomes generated help inform improved conservation delivery across the agency. Today's webinar is another great illustration of how science-based CEAP assessments not only quantify wildlife response, in this case, shrubland birds, but also generate important insight as to how planters and producers can improve the land for shrubland birds in eastern forests, as well as small farming operations in the Northeast. In recent years, NRCS has increased attention to helping landowners and producers provide for the needs of shrubland birds and other species that rely on young forests and other early successional habitats. We rely on the best science coming from our university partners to provide the best assistance possible to our cooperators on the land. Today, we are excited to share a compilation of findings of numerous CEAP-supported studies in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station and University of Massachusetts focused on improving our understanding of how shrubland birds respond to various management practices and how producers can help those at-risk species on productive agriculture and forest lands. Thank you for joining us today. With that, I would like to turn it over to Charlie Reba, CEAP Wildlife Component Leader, to introduce today's presenter. Charlie.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Like Mark said, I'm Charlie Rewa, the NRCS Wildlife Component Leader for the Conservation Effects Assessment Project. And so thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. We're excited to share some outcomes findings from a series of CEAP-supported studies on how our work with farm and forest producers can provide important habitats for shrubland birds in the Northeast, or in the eastern forests in general, a group of species that have been in decline in recent decades. So the agenda for today's webinar, first I'll share a few words about the CEAP Wildlife Component and how we operate. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. David King, he's a research wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. We should have some time at the end to address some questions that come in during the presentation portion of the webinar, so please feel free to put those in the question box as we go along. So CEAP Wildlife, really CEAP has several different components. Today we're just focused on the wildlife component specifically. And our objective is to document fish and wildlife outcomes from NRCS conservation work and to use those outcomes to inform more effective conservation delivery. And so we work across agency divisions in our headquarters, in our state offices, and others to identify the priority assessment needs on which to focus. We do rely on cooperative partnerships with the wildlife science community, including universities, NGOs, and state and other federal agencies. So since 2005, CEAP Wildlife has been supporting outcome-based assessments through over 80 cooperative agreements with science partners. Assessment findings and reports and other documents are all listed on the CEAP website, which is included in today's links. The abundance of early successional forests and shrublands in the East has declined in recent decades. And in response, NRCS has been increasing attention to working with farm and forest owners and operators to provide habitat for these at-risk species while maintaining productive agricultural and forestry operations. So in response to this increased attention on shrubland conservation, CEAP Wildlife has supported a number of assessments to help us understand how shrubland birds respond to our work and to inform more effective delivery of our conservation efforts. And specifically, since 2006, CEAP Wildlife has been working in partnership with Dr. David King's lab at the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station and University of Massachusetts to assess the habitat needs of shrubland birds and to help us understand how conservation practices benefit these birds and how we can help producers support shrubland birds in working landscapes. So today's presentation, like Mark said, is a compilation of findings from this science partnership and highlights some of the outcomes and science products developed through this body of work, which has been very productive in the past decade or so. So now with that, I'd like to just turn the floor over to Dr. Dave King for the main webinar presentation. And I'll be back at the end of the webinar for the Q&A session. So Dr. King, the mic is yours.
Terrific. Thanks, Charlie. It's great to have this opportunity to share a decade and a half or so of accomplishments that we've generated over in collaboration with NRCS. And so, as Charlie mentioned, shrubland birds, those are bird species that use habitats that with little or no canopy and a dense woody or herbaceous understory that results as from anthropogenic or natural disturbance. Shrubland birds are of elevated interest to both conservationists and managers. For instance, if you look at the percent of species that are considered under the state wildlife action plans in the eastern United States as species of greatest conservation need, you'll see that nearly 50% of grassland shrubland, that is disturbance-dependent bird species, are considered to be species of greatest conservation need, whereas, you know, in comparison, we're still concerned about forest birds, but actually the interest and concern about grassland shrubland disturbance-dependent birds is actually more elevated than forest birds. So there's a lot of conservationists that are concerned about shrubland birds. There's also a lot of researchers that are interested in shrubland birds. You can see that in the decade prior to the publication of this paper in 2011, that there's a steady increase in the number of citations, number of papers that were generated on the subject of shrubland birds, according to a Web of Science search. So two important constituencies of the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station are really concerned about shrubland birds, that is to say, managers and conservationists and fellow researchers. And so as a result of this concern, in collaboration with the NRCS CEAP program, we embarked on a series of studies, related studies, to provide reliable information to managers to allow them to more efficiently and effectively plan and evaluate their projects to promote shrubland bird populations. And so I'm going to give you a brief outline of the talk. It consists of a number of different phases. The first phase is assessing the benefits of conservation practices for shrub birds. We subsequently adopted shrubland bird as its shrub bird is a little archaic, and it's also potentially confused with a shrub wetland, which is an ecological community. Phase 2 is developing guidelines for promoting shrubland birds and pollinator services. Phase 3 is optimization model for mature forest and shrubland birds, that is to try and reconcile concerns on the part of managers about shrubland bird habitat creation on mature forest birds. Shrubland, we formalized all this information, or we are formalizing all this information into a shrubland bird decision support tool. And then we are working on developing a better understanding of conservation opportunities on small diversified farms, which is a growing sector in the agriculture in the Northeast. And then finally, I'm going to describe to you some work we're doing on quantifying the ecosystem services provided by birds to farmers. And here on the left, that's a chestnut-sided warbler, which is a frequently encountered species of shrubland bird in our region. And so in this first phase, assessing the benefits of conservation practices for shrub birds, this is actually divided into several different steps. The first was a literature review just to assess the state of our knowledge. So we recruited a postdoc, Dr. Scott Schlossberg, who undertook the bulk of the work, and provided a number of different products from this literature review. For instance, there had been a number of different lists of species that are considered shrubland birds by Randy Detmers, Peter John and Sauer, Hunter and DeGraff and Yamasaki, and none of them really agreed. All of them had some of the same species listed, but there wasn't really an authoritative list, so we attempted to reconcile this by reviewing the literature and developing this early successional index, which is the second to right column, second to last column on this sheet. And birds with an index higher than 50% and or occurred on 3 or 4 of the expert lists that were already existing, we considered shrubland birds. So this was one of the products from the first part of that first phase. The literature review was an authoritative and standardized list of shrubland birds for our region. We also engaged in meta-analysis where we used perimeter estimates from previous studies to generate relationships of birds with various environmental variables. For instance, here is some results from a paper where we looked at chestnut-sided warbler abundance, that's on the vertical axis, as a function of year since treatment, and these are regenerating clear cuts, and we're able to generate a curve that describes the abundance of chestnut-sided warblers through time, through successional time, showing, of course, that they're absent right when the clear cut is created, pretty much also absent about 20 years post-treatment, and really most abundant in intermediate. And that's important information, of course, for planning and evaluation for managers. And also for this project, this first phase of the project, we were able to analyze archive data sets. We've been doing shrubland bird research in the lab for a while and had amassed a lot of data. And this project gave us the opportunity to do a combined analysis of this. And for instance, if you look at the if you look at the bottom, that's a bottom frame, that's a shrubland habitat, regenerating clear-cut with little or no canopy, and then dense shrubs and herbaceous. The top one, frame actually shows prairie warbler density from the data that we had in hand that we analyzed as part of this project in clear-cuts, power line rights-of-ways, scrub oak barrens, treated pitch pine, wildlife openings, and beaver ponds. And these are really the kind of shrublands that we have in Massachusetts. And you can see in the middle, that dark column, that's scrub oak barrens. That's where prairie warblers really are most abundant in Massachusetts. And that is going to become important in the next phase of the project that I'm going to describe to you, which is trying to get at the contribution of deliberate management to the conservation of these species. So I just showed you that, and there's a number of different components that go into that. And the first one is what I just showed you, the habitat-specific abundance for the different shrub and bird species in our region. We were also able to generate habitat extent as part of this effort, and we used a variety of things. This is just for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts because we had data, but Massachusetts is pretty representative of a northeastern state. We were able to get habitat extent from both timber harvest plans that have been filed with the state of Massachusetts. Also, MassGIS has a really good shrubland habitat layer. So we were able to figure out how much shrubland habitat was on the landscape, and we were also able to figure out who was creating it and why, and that allowed us to determine which habitat patches, shrubland habitat patches, had been created as part of incidental activities like commercial timber harvest or power line rights-of-ways. These are activities that are not directed explicitly at biodiversity versus intentional management, activities that were directed explicitly and intentionally to support biodiversity and shrubland birds. And so this allowed us to figure out what the contribution of these conservation practices was to shrubland bird conservation in Massachusetts. And what we found is most of the shrubland in Massachusetts, about 72%, is on private lands and is not shrubland habitat that's not created explicitly for biodiversity. It's created in the course of commercial activities like logging. And a relatively small proportion, like 28%, of the shrubland habitat in Massachusetts is directed specifically, is created and maintained explicitly for conservation of shrub-dependent biodiversity like shrubland birds. And this includes land on the Department of Conservation and Recreation, state land, Mass Division of Fish and Wildlife. A lot of this is actually supported by NRCS programs. And so we can see that a relatively small proportion of shrubland habitat in Massachusetts is created explicitly to promote shrubland-dependent biodiversity. However, if you look at a couple of shrubland bird species, for instance, indigo bunting and field sparrow, we were able to calculate that nearly half of the indigo buntings and half of the field sparrows in Commonwealth of Massachusetts are on habitats that were created explicitly for biodiversity. So although only 28% of habitat in the Commonwealth is created explicitly for biodiversity and shrubland birds, it supports almost half of these two species and a lot of other shrubland bird species. And so we can see that these directed conservation efforts are disproportionately effective and support a lot of shrubland birds. So that was phase one of the project. So as usual, research brings up questions as it answers them. And so here's the report that we produced from that first phase in 2007. It's been cited about 65 times. And some of the things that we weren't able to resolve in this report in literature review meta-analysis were questions like, what are the patch area thresholds? We were able to determine in that report that shrubland birds are more abundant in larger openings, less abundant in smaller openings, but what are the actual thresholds? Because that would be information that would be helpful to managers in their planning and evaluation activities. Also, what are the influences of landscape? We know that for mature forest birds, that development and amount of forest in the landscape affects the abundance of birds in a given patch. Is that true for shrubland birds? It wasn't clear from the literature that we reviewed in the first phase of the project. And then finally, we were able to show that shrubland birds are associated with open canopy conditions with dense shrub layer, but really how open does a forest have to be, a site have to be in order to support shrubland birds? So what are actual thresholds to basal area retention? And so for those, we engage in the second phase, developing guidelines for promoting shrubland birds and pollinator services. I'm not going to talk about the pollinator services today. The objectives were to get at those patch area thresholds and landscape influences. The way we went about doing this is we recruited a graduate student, Patrick Roberts, and he established a number of sites in central Massachusetts. Here's an example of one of his study sites. It consists of a number of polygons. Those polygons are group selection cuts, and that linear strip in the bottom is a power line right away. And these cuts range from a fraction of an acre up to about 3 acres. And so Patrick went out there and he did point count surveys, which are a way of getting standardized measure of bird abundance. You count all the birds in a certain amount of time, 10 minutes in this case, in a certain radius. In this case, it was just within the perimeter of the openings. And that gives you a standardized measure you can compare. And what he came up with is that, indeed, the shrubland birds that occurred at these sites were area sensitive. So you can see that this is probability of occurrence on the vertical axis, and though that is patch area on the x-axis, and it's in hectares because we published this in the Journal of Wildlife Management, and they request that we use SI units. You can see that all of these shrubland birds are more abundant in larger openings than smaller openings. However, the thresholds, the point at which they reach the maximum probability of occurrence, varies a lot, from black and white warblers that will reach their maximum occurrence in an opening as small as 1/4 of a hectare, to prairie warblers that even in a 1.5 hectare patch, they're still actually not 100% abundant. So it shows that there is a fair amount of variability, and more importantly, it shows explicitly how big a patch, I mean, for any given patch size, what is the probability of one of these shrubland birds occurring in it. And so we were also interested in the landscape influences. So Patrick also analyzed bird abundance not only in terms of patch size, but also in terms of proximity to large patches of shrubland, for instance, these power line rights-of-ways. And what he found is that for only one species, prairie warbler was the only species that was sensitive to the amount of shrubland habitat in the landscape. And for example, for a 0.4 hectare opening, this is again probability of occurrence on the vertical axis, and it's distance from the power line right away on the horizontal axis. And you can see that when you're out 3,000 meters, 3 kilometers away from a power line right away, you're very unlikely to have a prairie warbler in a patch. But as you get closer to that power line corridor, 2,000 and 1,000 meters from it, then right up next to it, the probability of occurrence for a prairie warbler goes up to about 0.62%. So it illustrates that for prairie warblers, they're more likely to use a patch that's smaller than their threshold size when it's closer to one of these large patches. And this will be important in a future stage of the project. So we were able to generate information that provided guidance for managers and conservationists in terms of managing shrubland birds. But a lot of our constituents, of course, are interested in mature forest birds too. For instance, in the left hand of this slide, you can see a Blackburnian warbler and ovenbird. Those are birds that tend to occur in closed canopy forests during the nesting season. Wood thrush, rose-breasted grosbeak, and black-throated blue warbler in the center. Those are species that occur in an intermediate stage or perhaps a shelter woodcut. And it's really the shrubland birds, the chestnut-sided warbler, prairie warbler, and common yellowthroat that are really use these regenerating clear cuts. And you can't manage for all these species on the same site. So how really is a manager to make decisions, rational decisions, objective decisions about management decisions for any given parcel of land? And so we engaged on this optimization model for mature forest and shrubland birds to try and figure out a way to balance the needs of these groups. And so basically, conceptually, we expected that for a shrubland species for a chestnut-sided warbler, they'd be most abundant in a regenerating clear-cut and least abundant or absent in these closed canopy forests. And in order to develop explicit functions to describe this relationship between management intensity and shrubland bird abundance, we recruited a postdoc, Dr. Mike Akresh, who is now at Antioch University, and he reviewed hundreds of studies on bird responses to management, and of those, 34 had information on both basal area retention and shrubland bird abundance. And he was able to use these data in a meta-analysis to generate functions such as this: chestnut-sided warbler density on the vertical axis versus the percent basal area retained on the horizontal axis. So you can see on the left side of that graph, 0% basal area retained. That's basically we're generating clear cut. You can see that chestnut-sided warblers are most abundant in their generating clear cut. And then all the way over on the right, that's basically a closed canopy forest. And chestnut-sided warblers are essentially absent from that. And this basically functions like this allow us to tell managers really that for any given level of basal area retention that is corresponding to a silvicultural treatment, we can tell them what the probability of getting a chestnut-sided warbler or a prairie warbler, for instance. And prairie warblers exhibited a similar pattern. The difference is that chestnut-sided warblers seem to be a little more tolerant of basal area retention, at least up to about 5% retention. So that's the shrubland part. Now, for any given basal area retention corresponding to a silvicultural prescription, we can tell you what the probability of having a shrubland bird in it. What about the mature forest birds? And for this, Mike undertook a meta-analysis of and included 33 studies and was able to generate functions such as this, describing black-throated green warbler response to basal area retention. And here you see the opposite pattern. Basal area density, black-throated green warbler density is on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, again, is basal area retention. You can see over on the left where there's 0% basal area retention, that's essentially a clear cut. You have no black-throated green warblers. They're most abundant over on the right side of that graph where there's 100% basal area retention corresponding to 1. Interestingly, some birds, for instance, the scarlet tanager, which is widely considered to be a closed canopy forest interior species, they're actually as abundant in sites with a basal area retention of about 60% as they were in a completely closed canopy forest. And so that's going to be important, again, a little later on when we get to trying to develop tools to try and describe, to try and formalize these data in a form that's more readily accessible to managers. So the question is, I guess Hewlett-Crawford 1981 paper said you can't call silviculture either categorically beneficial or detrimental to birds because some birds will respond positively to any kind of treatment, whereas others will respond negatively. So how do you make an objective decision given that on how beneficial any silvicultural activity is to birds? Well, one way to do that is to use these Partners in Flight conservation scores. And so at Partners in Flight, it's a consortium of NGOs, government agencies. What Partners in Flight did is they got together and they developed these conservation ranks. And if you look at the rightmost column, RCS-B, these are the conservation scores for all of the bird species that basically occur in North America. And so I'm just showing you a selection of them here just to make a point. And so these are basically the sum of a number of other different threats, like what percentage of the population is in your region, in this case a bird conservation region, how steep is the species declining, increasing, how steeply is it declining, how chronic and acute are the threats, things like that. So they basically score each one of those threats, sum them up, and that gives you the RCS sub B, which is what we call an overall conservation score. And so in this case, you can see a yellow-rumped warbler for our conservation region has a population trend that's pretty stable, large population, and not a lot of chronic and acute threats. It gets a relatively low score of 7. In contrast, a prairie warbler, whose populations are small and declining relatively, and is threatened by habitat encroachment, they get a high score of 17. And I should point out it's not just shrubland birds that got high scores. The scarlet tanager we just talked about, which is a forest bird, also gets a very high score. And so anyway, you take these scores, and then a fellow named Nuttall came up with an ingenious way of combining them into a overall conservation value. So the conservation value is the abundance, that's A, times the conservation score, that's W, and for each species, you multiply those together and then sum them over all species, and it gives you a number. And if that number is higher, according to this logic, then that activity or that site is more valuable to conservation than one with a lower score. And so we employed this approach in order to try and make general statements about the effect of silvicultural treatments on bird conservation. And so what we came up with, this is again work done by Dr. Mike Akresh, and so he did this separately for a bunch of these bird conservation regions because we wanted to make sure that the results were broadly applicable. However, bird composition, bird species composition differs regionally. And so what you can see for these is that in all cases, okay, so these graphs here, I'm showing you 4 graphs, and these are for 4 different bird conservation regions. These are 13, 14, 28, and 30. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, that's the community-wide conservation score, that CV that I just showed you. So that includes the sum of all birds, the sum of, let's see, it includes basically shrubland and mature forest bird conservation scores. And so what you can see is that and then on the horizontal axis, again, that's basal area retention, with 0 being basically a clear cut and 1 being a closed canopy forest. And what you can see is in all cases that the bird conservation score for a given site is lowest for an unmanaged closed canopy forest. It's in many cases highest for 0 basal area retention, that it's regenerating clear cuts, and in many cases, in other cases, it's highest for about 60–70% basal area retention. That would correspond to something like a first century shelter would in our area. And so at first this might seem counterintuitive. However, there's a number of things that make us sort of feel a little more comfortable with the results. The first one is, of course, that if you look in partner and flight scores, those numbers I just showed you, conservation scores, that's the average conservation scores on the vertical axis, are actually higher for early successional bird species than for mature forest bird species. That's because in our region, shrubland birds are generally declining more rapidly and face more threats than mature forest birds, although we're plenty concerned about mature forest birds. But anyway, this explains sort of the high conservation scores for these BCRs with 0 basal area retention. And so that 70%, that spike in bird conservation score around 60–70%, that might be partially explained by this collection of plots. Now these are plots for mature forest bird species with density on the y-axis, the vertical axis, basal area retention on the horizontal axis, and you can see for a lot of these bird species, eastern wood pewee, scarlet tanagers are pronounced examples, blue-headed vireo. A lot of these species are actually most abundant in areas in the stands with about 60–70% basal area retention. And so those areas with 60–70% basal area retention have some shrubland birds, which are high priority, and a bunch of these mature forest birds, which are also high priority, and that really drives up the conservation score. And so really the take home is that management actually has the potential in this case to benefit bird conservation in our region. And one reason for that response of mature forest bird species is, as a number of people have pointed out, eastern forests are sort of are low, are depauperate in terms of structural and species diversity as a result of land use history. A lot of our forests have basically regenerated from human disturbance and regenerated in even-age condition, and we really haven't got to the point where we've got large trees that are actually undergoing natural mortality and creating gaps and stuff. So our unmanaged forests, really, in a lot of cases, are not necessarily representative of a historical condition. I think that Bryce Hannaberry has pointed this out in papers that she's written about woodlands. A number of scholars have actually looked at this. Steve Shifley has looked at this in terms of the forests themselves. So that's our optimization, phase 3. During the course of this project, we generated a lot of papers about shrubland birds, and I think this is a useful exercise because it helps share our results with other researchers who are then able to incorporate them into their own viewpoints, their own research, but also it means that if a manager or conservationist is adopting a practice based on our findings, they're able to point out that these are peer-reviewed findings and that it may give them more weight and thus give the decisions more weight too. So we developed a lot of shrub and bird research, but it's not really in the job description for a lot of managers and conservationists to spend a lot of time in the library. And so we engage in a lot of technology transfer, like workshops, white papers, and other sorts of interactions to convey this information. But we were really interested in formalizing this into a more accessible form. And for that reason, we've been working on this Shrubland Bird Decision Support Tool. And this is basically an adaptation of a decision support tool that was developed by a team led by Keith Nislow, fisheries biologist and team leader with the Northern Research Station. He developed a brook trout decision support tool that's been really popular, and so he suggested that we adapt it, and we've been working with Keith's team to basically adapt the brook trout tool to shrubland birds. And so we're calling it an interim title is Predictor of Avian Communities Tool. And here you see the welcome page. It's got an introduction talking about shrubland birds, declines, how to get started with PACT. I'm going to show you that just now. And then explain some of the features. And then it talks about game birds, which basically their habitat needs exceed a patch. They basically require coverts, so we're unable to really make recommendations about game birds based on the types of calculations we made for songbirds. So we actually direct the users to resources. Each one of these buttons leads to a link on wild turkey, American woodcock, or ruffed grouse, respectively. And so the way the tool starts, the foundation of the tool is actually these base maps that show distribution of birds. And these are developed by another NRS researcher, Stephen Matthews, who generated these abundance maps for North American birds based on the breeding bird survey data and also tree atlas data. And so basically what we have here is a heat map for a portion of our study region where the cooler colors blue are lower abundance and the brighter colors are higher abundance, in this case for prairie warbler. And so you're able to select a given species using these occupancy layers. And then there's a little pull down here. If you hit that song icon, this screen comes down that's got the prairie warbler picture on it.
Your line is now muted.
Prairie warbler song. You can hit the little eye icon and it will give you information about the prairie warbler's ecology. Anyway, so we have that for all of the 42 shrubland bird species that we were able to identify in our meta-analysis. And so what you can do with this is you can either search the map by putting your zip code or town name or street name or address in the search map window in the upper right-hand corner. Or if you just put in your zip code and it gives you Pelham, you can actually, you can either draw a polygon that represents, for instance, a cut that or an area you might want to treat with silviculture, or you can upload shapefiles. So if you choose to draw, hit that draw icon. You can draw an opening, and here I've drawn an opening, and I've actually selected standard units. And so I've drawn the opening. I've specified that there is no large opening within 3 kilometers because we know for prairie warblers that might be influential. I specified 0 basal area, 6 years elapsed time, 6 years post-treatment, and then it yields the opening perimeter and the opening area. The opening's 5 acres. And so once you do that, you hit that button, Analyze, and this right-hand window pops up. In this right-hand window, the analysis results, there's a little icon there you can press that will give you a little more information about that. What it gives you is it gives you the bird species likely to use that opening in descending occupancy. The final occupancy is basically what we're talking about. And the ones with a final occupancy of greater than 50% are shaded in green. Those are the ones that are most likely to find. The partners and flight scores are there just for reference. If you hit any one of these graphs, it will actually present the graph and of that species. Down here are adjusters. These are sliders that we'll experiment with for a bit. In a bit, there's also a little eye icon there that explains a bit more. The opening area, basal area, and time are basically the three functions in addition to the regional abundance from the base map that you can mess with the sliders. Opening area in this case is maxed out at 5 acres because we don't know actually if beyond that shrubland birds respond to shrubland opening area. That's probably an area for future research. Basal area is set to 0, time is set to 6 years, and you can see that the conservation value of the management opening is 115.47 down at the bottom. So that is basically the sum of the occupancies times the partners and flight scores summed over all the species that are present. Then, and down here there's information, images of silviculture treatments. And so suppose you want to look at the effects of opening area on the birds in this area, project area, and the conservation value. You can actually move this slider from down to say 2.5 acres or something like that. And what you can see is a number of these bird species actually decline. The red, those red values with the minuses behind them indicate the decrease in occupancy of those species. And you can see that a number of them declined, alder flycatcher, field sparrow in particular. And then you can look down here, the conservation value of the management opening is dropped about 21 points. And so that sort of gives you an idea of the importance of opening size. You can also look at basal area. So let's reset the opening size to 5 acres and then set basal area to around 58 feet per hectare. And so there you see again that most of these shrubland birds actually declined with basal area of 58 feet squared per acre. And you can see the conservation value down there at the bottom is decreased by almost 52 points. All right, so let's see about time since treatment. Suppose you're curious about how long the effects of this management are going to persist on the landscape. We'll set opening area back to 5, basal area back to 0, and time up to 10 years. You can see again that a lot of these shrubland bird species have a decrease in abundance, number have actually increased, and the conservation value of the management opening has decreased, but only by 10 points. So these sliders allow, for instance, a service forester to describe the impacts of a potential management program to a landowner, or a manager might use it for their own use. And so this is just shrubland so far. We're planning on getting mature forest birds in, and we're having a hard time getting them out. So the decision support tool, that's another phase that we're working on now, and the next step is to get those maps. For the mature forest birds, we already have the functions generated, so hopefully we can do that rapidly. So shrublands in our area are regionally scarce. So if you look, for instance, I think this is for Massachusetts, and you look at the percent land cover, 96% of forest, but it's only 3.5% of that is young forest. So there's not a lot of shrubland habitat out in the landscape. And of course, we know that it changes rapidly. So unless we're vigilant in terms of our management, the shrubland habitat is going to decrease even more. And so for that reason, we're really interested in understanding opportunities for shrubland bird conservation, any opportunities that there are. And so for that reason, we've done surveys in beaver meadows, we've done surveys, power line rights-of-ways to really figure out what's out there in the landscape. But what's come to our attention recently is these small farms in the region. So by small farms, we mean generally about less than 50 acres. That's a USDA designation. And small farms, farms of that size are actually an increasing sector of the agricultural industry that's increasing in this region. And so one thing that got us interested in it is these two panels on the right. And these are both aerial images. And the one from the top is from the Eugene Moran Wildlife Management Area. That's managed explicitly for wildlife, including shrubland birds. And you can see that if you're used to looking at these images, you can see that it consists largely of grassy and herbaceous growth with some shrubland and scattered trees. Well, if you look at the Simple Gifts CSA farm here in Amherst, Massachusetts, you can see it actually has similar types of habitats. So it's got a lot of this grassy herbaceous growth and shrubs and scattered trees. So this realization got us thinking that there could be important conservation opportunities on these lands that are increasing in extent in our region. And so for that reason, we embarked on the next phase of this project, which was to look at the bird conservation opportunities on these small diversified farms. And for this project, we recruited a master's student, Isabel Brodsky, and she was able to contact 22 farmers who would allow us to work on their farms. And she went to those farms and she did, again, those standardized point count surveys, and she measured habitat at each one of those points. And she was able to generate, first of all, figure out what kind of birds were on these small diversified farms and what sort of habitat features on the farms were associated with the abundance of these species. And so some of the results that she got were the number of shrubland birds that are on there, common yellowthroat, is that top one, song sparrow, gray catbird, and indigo bunting. So those are all shrubland birds that we're interested in. And so those are all positively associated with a gradient from bare ground to tall, dense, woody vegetation. So if you want to explain to farmers how to promote the welfare of these birds, this is a way to do it. Conversely, for these pest species like European starling and house sparrow, they're actually most abundant on bare ground. So again, this is with these habitat associations, we're able to make recommendations to farmers that not only help them promote priority wildlife, but potentially decrease numbers of agricultural pests. So through Isabel's work, we realized that there were a lot of important birds on these farms. And so what we did in order to try and figure out how these farms measured up to other types of shrubland in the Commonwealth, we generated these conservation values. Again, using each species abundance, each species conservation score multiplied together and summed over all species at a site. And we did this using, again, those archive data sets that we collected over years here in Massachusetts. And for instance, if you look on the vertical axis, that's the conservation score. On the horizontal axis, you have beaver ponds, clear cuts, farms, forest openings, those are the ones Patrick Roberts studied, power line rights-of-ways, and wildlife openings. And those numbers at top are basically, and the height of the columns are the conservation score. And you can see that farms with a conservation score of 686 really measure up to a number of different habitats in the Commonwealth, shrubland habitats in the Commonwealth, that are widely recognized to be important for shrubland birds, so that this habitat that we're not paying for in order to create is actually harboring a lot of birds that are of conservation interest. Some of the species that are really more distinctive of these small farms, the yellow-billed cuckoo and willow flycatcher, those are species that were really abundant on these farms, less abundant in those other types of habitats. So indeed, these farms do offer conservation opportunities for priority wildlife. So birds, of course, a lot of these birds are insectivorous, highly insectivorous during the breeding season. They feed their young almost exclusively on insects, and so they're voracious predators, and are, during daylight hours, they are foraging for insects nonstop. And a lot of these insects probably include agricultural pests. And so based on some work that we've been encountered, some coffee work that we've been doing in the tropics, it occurred to us that these birds might be providing valuable ecosystem services to farmers in the form of pest control. And so that was the subject of the next phase of this project, using genetic analysis to quantify consumption of agricultural pests by birds on small diversified farms. And so for this project, we recruited Sam Main, standing there in the middle, to undertake the work. And that's Isabel on its right. And then that's David Murillo from Honduras. Incidentally, we just got an NSF award that's going to support David to do this same work in coffee farms in Honduras. Anyway, the way that Sam went about this is he put out mist nets that harmlessly captured birds. He put them up on farms, captured birds, and he put them in those little white bags that he's holding, and the birds defecate, and then after release, Sam would carefully scrape up that fecal sample and bring it back to UMass, where with the assistance of Dr. Jeremy Anderson in Joe Elkinson's lab, he would analyze it for pest DNA. And so that was how he was able to determine the frequency with which certain species on these farms consume pest insects. And so in addition, he also wanted to figure out how much the presence of birds decreased pest abundance and damage to crops. And so what he did to accomplish that is he made these frames, covered them with mist net that basically excluded birds. And so the idea is that those sites from which birds are excluded, and then he would periodically monitor the number of insects on those crop species, on those crop plants, within the exclosure, outside the exclosure, and the difference in pest abundance between the exclosure and the plants that birds had access to was essentially a measure of how much birds were decreasing pest numbers and damage to crops in the system. And so some preliminary results, he found that 2 bird species had a high frequency of pest DNA in their fecal samples. For instance, gray catbird had almost 18% of gray catbird samples had pest insect DNA in them, and more like 17% common yellowthroats had pest DNA in their fecal samples. And so this is comparable to other systems, showing that these birds indeed are eating a fair amount of pests. When you compare the percent damage, for instance, within and outside the controls, so you can see that on the vertical axis, that's percent damage. And then there's 3 pairs of columns. For brassicas, which are like kale and cabbage, cucurbits in the middle, those middle 2 columns, those are cucumbers and melons. And solanaceae, I think the only solanaceae we had was eggplant. And so there's 2 columns. One on the left, the darker one is the exclosure, where birds didn't have access to, versus controls. And you can see that for all of those 3 crop categories, there was lower damage on the plants that were exposed to bird predation. So this suggests that birds were actually decreasing damage and providing an ecosystem service to farmers in terms of pest control. So Isabel showed us that we can actually manipulate the number of birds, or in theory we should be able to manipulate habitat to enhance the number of certain birds on farms. And so the next step is actually going to be developing a link between habitat management and ecosystem services by birds, so that a farmer could, for instance, enhance types of habitats that support birds that are most effective in terms of reducing pest insects. So in summary, shrubland birds are legitimate conservation targets. Now, I didn't really talk about this, but a big part of this project was actually to figure out whether or not they really were legitimate. There's a fair amount of controversy regarding whether or not shrubland birds are a natural part of the bird fauna in this region, etc. And so, but I think through our work, we were actually able to establish that is the case. Specific management prescriptions for shrubland birds were generated. An online decision support tool for shrubland birds was developed, and we're working on getting mature forest birds in there so that managers can understand the trade-off. The trade-offs between shrubland and forest bird habitat management were illustrated. Farms complement habitats provided on conservation lands, and the birds on farms consume pests, protecting crops. So again, thanks for your attention. It's been a really valuable collaboration. We look forward to years of fruitful collaboration in the future. I'd be happy to entertain any questions if there are any at this point. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Dave, for that presentation. There's an awful lot there to try and digest. We've just got a few minutes left. There was one question I saw came in on the chat talking about the list of shrubland birds that Scott Schlossberg put together. And is there any specific order to that, or are they just listed by taxonomic order, or how is that listed?
Abundance, decreasing abundance.
Okay. So the ones that are least abundant are listed first as a priority. Is that how it goes?
Let's see, the list of priority bird species. Let's see, do you mean from the Schlossberg and King report, right?
Yes, I think that's what the question was from.
Yeah, those were listed in terms of decreasing ESI, the index that we used to, so the ones that at the top of the list are the most strongest shrubland associates.
Okay. Let's see, there's a couple other questions that came in here. Is there anything we can do to encourage the presence of shrubland birds? I guess that's some of the recommendations. We actually have a CEAP conservation insight and development right now for the small farms that should be out in the next couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I guess another question was, are similar efforts underway in other parts of the U.S.?
Yeah, there's a lot of work on shrubland birds or agriculture. I mean, there's a lot of work on shrubland birds. I mean, I think now really it's become clear that shrubland birds, although there's a lot of logging, for instance, in the Pacific Northwest, my understanding is that broadleaf suppression is they're so aggressive with that they're not really getting shrubland bird habitat. So they're also kind of concerned about shrubland birds in the Pacific Northwest, for instance. And in terms of agriculture, I think a lot of this agricultural work has been done in vineyards, and some of that, a lot of the work that we're building on is actually work that's been done in the West.
Okay. There's a question in here. Could you repeat why tract size was limited to 5 acres in the decision tool?
Yeah, pretty much beyond that, we have no evidence that abundance continues to increase beyond 5 acres. And so at this point, it's an outstanding, so basically all our functions end before you get to 5 acres. So we're unable to really generate any information past that. But I think we recently have a bunch of data collected by a colleague of ours, Jeff Richardson, who runs the Forces for the Birds with Mass Audubon, and we're working on analyzing those data to see whether or not we can fill out some of those functions for larger patch sizes.
Okay, great. There was another question here, shrubland birds in the south. I'm not quite sure what that's referring to, whether that's just like, are we concerned about shrubland birds in the south as we are in the northeast? I guess so.
Yeah. So that paper that Scott and I published in 2014, we actually looked at shrubland bird habitat trends throughout eastern forests, and they're declining. They're declining throughout. Some places less than others. For instance, places where they do a lot of industrial pulp. You know, there's obviously a lot of harvest. Now, how much a shrub and habitat results from that is an open question, because again, they're aggressive about controlling broadleaf plants. But yeah, I think a lot of these shrubland bird species are species of concern throughout their range. Like prairie warbler, I think every state it occurs in listed as the species of greatest conservation need, or certainly most of them.
Yeah. So there's one more question here before I run out of time. It's actually a question I had, but someone else put it in there about when will the predictor of avian communities tool be available for public use? I know you said you're still working on the forest land bird component, but people want to know when they can get their hands on it.
As soon as possible. How about by the end of the year?
By the end of the year?
Yeah. You heard it.
Will that be posted like on your Forest Service website, and we can put links on our CEAP website, or how will that work?
Let's discuss that. I think it would be great to get links on the CEAP website.
Okay. All right, let's see. There was one more question here. Is there any data on the type of shrubs, i.e. native shrub versus invasives, for shrubland bird population numbers?
Yeah, so invasive shrubs don't support as many invertebrates. And invertebrates, of course, are important prey. I think that's at least a couple of studies have shown that. But we showed that again, as part of this project, we did an analysis of a bunch of nesting data we had and found that bird nesting success was actually higher in invasives, which is contrasts with studies from like the Carey Institute that found an opposite pattern. But of course, we're working in shrublands, they're working in forests. That might be part of the reason we find a contrasting result.
Interesting. Well, I think we're at the top of the hour. The work will continue. I think I'll turn it back over to Liz to close us out, and thank you, Dave.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Mark Hsu, Charlie Rewa, and Dave King for today's presentation, and thanks also to everyone who attended the webinar today. We hope to see you again for future webinars, and have a great afternoon.